Well, hello, everybody. My name is Nikki Gould. I'm one of your local master gardeners, and I have the absolute pleasure to introduce Peyton Ellas. Peyton has been a master gardener since 2008. She is also the owner of Quercus Landscape Design, a design and build firm founded in 2005 that specializes in California native plant-based landscapes. She is the author of the book, Gardening with California Native Plants Inland, Foothill, and Central Valley Gardens, and writes a monthly column about garden care, both the edible and ornamental gardens. Take it away, Peyton.
Hey, thank you. Thanks, Nikki, and thanks to everyone for being here. So this is about a 20-minute slideshow, and it's really about very basic things that I've learned over the years about starting with and working with California native plants. And then there will be time at the end to answer questions if you have some that you brought with you, or if there's some questions that come up in the presentation. If you would just type your questions into the chat, Nikki will be hosting that part. And so we'll hold our questions to the end. Either type your questions or wait till the end and just ask them when we unmute everybody. So I think Carol is going to mute everyone except me, just to keep the background distraction noises off. And I will be cueing Carol to go ahead and change the slides as we go. So you can go ahead and go on to the next slide, Carol. I'll just... Okay, so the basic first thing that I wanted to either remind us or point out is that California is a really big state. And so we have native plants that stretch from all the way up from at the Oregon border and all the way down to the Mexican border. The California floristic province there is the Mediterranean region. And we are on the edge of the Mediterranean region, on the eastern edge of that. So almost not in the floristic province. So that means that a lot of the plants that we grow and do well with in our Central California and foothill gardens are plants that may come from outside of the geographic boundary of California. So in other words, there are some plants that may do really well in your garden that are not California native. And in fact, some California native plants may not thrive in your garden. And that's because the state has all different kinds of geographic and horticultural regions. And it's good to keep that in mind, that just because it's a native plant doesn't mean that it's going to necessarily grow or thrive in your garden. Another thing to keep in mind is I like the map on the other side of the screen there because it shows some of the foundation rock regions of California, well, all of them really. And so if we look at where we're located in the Great Valley or the edge of the Great Valley in the Sierra Nevada, you can see the type of rock. And then you can see all the types of rock in California, and some of them are quite different than the rock that provides the foundation that is our soil in our native gardens. And so we may in fact choose some plants that are from the Mojave Desert, the Basin and Range, out into Nevada, Idaho, Arizona, and those plants might do really well in our gardens, where if we choose a plant up in the northern coast ranges, those plants, both because of the temperature, the microclimate, but also because of the foundation rock that creates the soil in the garden, those plants might not do as well. So those are just a couple of things to keep in mind as we're talking about California native plants, okay? Just because it's native doesn't mean it's going to grow in your garden, I guess is the lesson there. Okay, next slide. Also, it's good to keep in mind that native plants are indeed plants. Just full on, they're plants. And so normal rules will apply. Pay attention to the plant labels or research that you do to whether the plant needs to be placed in the sun or the shade. And we always like to say here, if the plant label says sun, if it's a plant that has its origin in a coastal region, it probably means that it needs some afternoon shade here in the valley. Not always, but often. And like all plants, you'll want to give your new native transplants some more care when they're babies, when they're young, and then just wean them off of that care as they age, just like any other plant. Also, it's good to keep in mind that just no matter how good we take care of our gardens, and despite our best research efforts, some plants are probably going to die. And the older your garden is, the more plants are going to die over time. That's just the way nature is, and that's the way our gardens are going to be too. So if you have a few failures with native plants, don't take it too personally and don't take it too seriously, because it's going to happen probably. But then there's some what I would call abnormal rules for California natives, or some specialty rules that we like to keep in mind. So because California is so large there and has about 6,000 native plants, there's certainly more than a few plants that will work in your yard. However, most of the most popular plants that we use in our gardens do like at least moderately draining soil. Fortunately, that includes most of the soils of the valley and foothill. So we really don't come across this, I don't have good draining soil, as often as sometimes it's put out there. Most of the soils that are have had any kind of agriculture history are moderately draining. And it doesn't mean that you have to have sandy or gravelly soil. However, if you have those kinds of soils, not to worry, because most native plants will also work in those kinds of soils. Another thing to keep in mind, many California native plants display some level of summer dormancy, and that just is common sense. When it's hot and dry, the plants have evolved to go with the flow and sort of take a summer dormancy period. And we'll talk a little bit more about all of these 4 bullet points in the slides coming up. But it's good to just keep that in mind, that your garden may look a little tired or a little semi-dormant or dormant in summer, and that would be perfectly natural. Also, most species, when you're planting them, like to be planted high. So we like to say to dig the hole that you're going to put the plant in, dig it high and wide. So it's probably less work, because if you have a 6-inch nursery container, you're probably going to dig your hole of 3 or 4 inches and plant that plant up high, especially if you're going to use mulch, which seems to be pretty important for native plants. The more natural the mulch, probably the better over the long run. However, you can use inorganic mulch or organic mulch. It doesn't seem to matter. Okay, next slide. I'll also say a little note on the photos of the plants that I'm using. I'm going to share a list of 10 plants that are probably the ones to start with if you've never gardened with native plants before, because they have a high tolerance of different garden conditions and different soil types and different care regimens. Some of the pictures are those plants on that list, and some of the pictures are plants that are not on that list. And that's just so that you can also see that there's a wide variety of beautiful plants that work in our valley and foothill gardens. Okay, so when I talked about most of our garden favorites in the native plant world, like moderately draining soil, there are some kind of hacks or shortcuts you can do to increase the drainage if you feel like your soil isn't draining well. And I will say a little aside that one quick test is to dig a little hole, like a 5-gallon nursery container size hole, fill it up with water, and then just wait till it drains. If it drains in a day or 2, that's fine. If it takes a week to drain, then yeah, you don't have good draining soil. If it drains in an hour or less, you have very good draining soil. Okay, so that's kind of a quick test. Okay, one way that you can increase the drainage in your garden or in areas of your garden is just to simply raise your plants up, like is done here with this California buckwheat, just to make a kind of a raised area. And next slide. We'll see another example of this in the next slide. Yeah, I got to give Carol a little more notice. Here you go, where there's also, you can see that down below in the my left corner, I guess it's your left corner too. You can see there's a little planting bed down there on the ground, and then a very simple concrete block retaining wall to make another level with a planting area. And so the plants in the top are, that water is going to drain out a lot quicker. So you can put some plants up there that that prefer good draining. And I'll just say, I'm talking about ceanothus, manzanita, buckwheat. All the species in those genii are do like at least moderate to moderately draining soil. So those are the ones you probably want to set up, but you can do also things like this woodland strawberry, and let it trail down. Okay, and the next slide, see another couple of ways you can increase the drainage. So you can, of course, put plants in containers. Just about all native plants do fine in containers. The same rules apply as any other plants. If you put a tree in a very small container, it's not going to do great because it won't have enough room for its roots. And you probably have to do a little bit more pruning to thin out and shape your plant for some of the species, but that's pretty much the same with all plants, whether they're in a container or not. Okay, next slide. And here's an example of a larger garden that we're working on. You can tell this picture was taken pretty recently because you can see how the air is full of smoke. But if you see there in the one slide on the left-hand side, and then the lower slide on the background left-hand slide, we are creating berms and swales in this garden, and that's to put some plants up on berms. And if you don't have a yard that's quite this size, you can still do small mounds or small berms. Just move the soil around and create some shapes in your garden, and then you can put those trickier plants up on berms to increase the drainage. Okay, next slide. Okay, and so let's say that we have chosen our plants and we're ready to plant. Here's a few quick tips on planting. I had mentioned most of the plants, you want to put them at or slightly above the soil level when they're planted. And you really can't do wrong even if you put grass, which usually the grasses don't care too much, but even if you plant it high, that's better than planting it too low. So the old fashioned where you dig kind of a inverted pyramid and with the water well, and you put the plant kind of lower so all the water will drain towards the plant, that doesn't work as well for California native plants. You really want to build them on a pyramid a little bit above the level. Or you have a couple of like an inch or two sticking up, and then you add the mulch, and that kind of tops them off. With California native plants, you don't need to put amendments of fertilizers in the planting hole. I know a lot of landscapers swear by putting timed release or amendment or some kind of boost in planting holes when they plant. Native plants neither want nor need all that fertilizer, especially nitrogen. They do not like a lot of nitrogen. Sometimes what happens is they'll grow great guns for a year and then conk out. So if you've ever heard of that problem, that's probably what's going on. Most native plants like thin soils, or when there's nitrogen in the soil, they do not use all that nitrogen that's in there. You do, however, want to plant your plant in wet ground and keep the soil moist for 2 weeks. And that is typical of all transplants, so that's nothing new. When I say moist, don't keep the soil like a bog or muddy for 2 weeks, but you want to keep some moisture in that soil for 2 weeks. And that's why, one of the reasons why we like to plant in the rainy season or just before the rainy season. It helps the plants get a good start. And then you can start weaning them away to have a little drier soil in between watering. Sometimes I have heard people say that if it's a native tree, they don't think they need to stake it or prune it, and that's just not true. A tree is a tree. So you may need to remove that nursery stake. Well, you do need to remove that nursery stake, full stop, but then you may need to go ahead and stake, tri-stake or double stake your trees to keep them from falling down in that first season during windstorms or oversaturated soil. and do a little thinning out if needed. As I already mentioned, mulch. And then one thing that's important that I think there's a myth that if a native plant is hardy, that it's going to be hardy from the get-go. And you really do want to protect those new plants from extremes for their first season. So if you're planting in the fall, you want to protect them from frost for their first winter. And how do we do that? Mulch, again, is very important because it will protect the crown and the roots. When you open that soil up to plant it, then air can get into the soil and reach the roots, and that might be frosty air. And sometimes we don't see the frost damage until the next June, when the plants are really coming out of winter dormancy and starting to grow. And then they don't have the root system they think they need. So you see a lot of problems, or you see a lot of die off, and sometimes plants just poop out in June, and that's a big reason why. So just protect them from frost. If you're planting in the spring, you want to do some protection for your plants from extreme heat, and that could be anywhere from hosing them off more often in that first summer. Sometimes you can do some shade covers for them, or just put a garden chair on the west side, something to give them a little bit more shade. And sometimes it might be just boosting the water a little bit more than you will in the next summers. Okay, next slide. Okay, then, so we've gotten our plants chosen and we've planted them, and now to maintenance. So I hear this a lot where people say, I want to have a California native plant garden because I don't want to have to maintain my garden, or I want to have low maintenance. And I think that it can be low maintenance, but I think it might be better to go into it with an idea that it's not going to necessarily be less maintenance right off, but it's going to be a different kind of maintenance. And it might be a kind of maintenance that is easier, but I think you should prepare yourself that you will need to take care of this garden, at least initially, until the plants are well established. One of the questions to ask is, are we going to do an annual pruning or regular pruning or somewhere in between? A lot of people who have native plant gardens end up doing pruning every fall, or sometimes a couple of times a year. And then some people want to keep their garden pruned on a more or less regular basis, so monthly or even weekly. And the great thing of this about the plants, they don't really care because they're just growing. And so you can change it up and mix it up and decide what you feel comfortable with and what looks good to you. So they're not that fancy, they're just plants. So you can go around and cut off pieces and see what happens. And the plants are fine with that. Weed management. You're going to have weeds, even with the native plant garden. So it's best to think ahead and decide on what are you going to do to control the weeds. And then as time goes on, you may find that you have fewer and fewer weeds, but I think at least at the very beginning, you should probably plan on doing some weed management, pretty heavy for the first seasons. One thing that where native plants do definitely lower your maintenance costs and time is they generally do not need any insecticides or fertilizers. I mentioned about the fertilizers, and then I'll say a couple of words about the insecticides. So native plants do attract aphids and sometimes scale. Sometimes we put down iron phosphate as a snail control for very young plants. But native plants generally tolerate a higher degree of insect damage and insect infestation than some of their non-native counterparts. And so when you see aphids on milkweed or sage, those two specifically, generally you don't have to do anything, just let the beneficials come in and the plants can tolerate a lot of that damage. Same thing with caterpillars. If you see caterpillars or you see the damage done by caterpillars chewing your native plants, You can think of the caterpillars as great bird food, and the native plants are probably going to be fine. Even if they get eaten down to practically nothing, they'll probably bounce right back. If it's too much, of course, you can do some hand picking and some hosing off of plants, but generally it's less than non-native plants. And then you also want to think about adding mulch every few years, or just doing a regular program of adding mulch either like buy a bag now and again, or get a hold of some tree trimmings when you can. That would be a free source, and just add them around. Mulch is constantly becoming soil, so it will be going away, and that's a good thing. But you want to just think about, okay, maybe every 3 to 5 years, you're going to replenish your mulch. Okay, thank you, Carol. Next slide. Okay, irrigation is a big thing, of course, with native plants, because we often have the idea that we can get away with not watering our native plant gardens, and that's just not true. So I'll just say, just have a plan how you're going to irrigate. It just like any other plants, as they age, they may require less because they're finding deeper and further away from your garden sources of water. And because the state is so large, there are some native plants who like regular water, a lot of water. A good example, of course, is a willow tree. Cottonwood is another one, but there are some smaller plants as well that like regular water or moderate water. And just because a plant can tolerate a lot of drought doesn't mean that you want to see that in your garden. So you may be watering your plants a little bit more just to keep them greener, even though they could completely withstand periods of no water. The establishment period for most native plant gardens is about 3 years, is what we see, and you can generally tell when it's getting established. It's one of those where it feels more settled. It feels like it's kind of settling in. But just if you can't see it, you can at least go by well, she said about 3 years, and it's been about 3 years. So just go by that. And then, as I mentioned before, many California native plants experience some level of summer dormancy. And I will say this is something that is really hard to know right off, because the signs of summer dormancy versus drought stress are very similar. I'm going to show you some pictures of some normal summer dormancy signs. And so that can help, but a lot of it you just have to ask. I'm around, or ask master gardeners, or other sources that you can say, is this plant summer dormant, or should I water it more? Some plants in the mint family, like all of our sages, we can keep them out of high level of summer dormancy by watering them more. But if you want to go with the low water system in the summer, just know that the plants are going to go dormant to some extent, and that's perfectly natural, and there's nothing you need to do about it. They will come back, and I'll show you some pictures in a minute to demonstrate that. Okay, and then you can see, just like is natural in our state, most of the plants will like most of their water when we get natural precipitation. So that's November through February. And if we're in a drought and there's not very much precipitation, you may need to water during the winter, especially for the trees, to make sure they get enough water during the period of time where they are used to getting it, and they are doing all of that storing of water in their tissues for later on in the season. Okay, next slide. Okay, so I'm going to show you a couple of pictures of just normal summer dormancy. The most famous one is probably the Buckeye tree. So the one picture on the one side with all the brown leaves, that is perfectly normal. That tree is completely alive, does this every summer, where the leaves turn brown. And out in the wild hills, a lot of the leaves blow off and fall down, and it's just bare sticks, and that's perfectly healthy and completely alive and completely what we call summer deciduous. Okay, we're more used to winter deciduous, but the Buckeye tree does summer deciduous as the ultimate survival mechanism. And then you can see on the other side, every single winter, it just comes out with new growth. And that is its pattern. And if you try to keep this tree out of summer deciduousness, you will probably overwater it and kill it. So you just have to let it do its thing, and it's beautiful. And learn to love it that way, I suppose. And the branches are gray, and as you can see, quite attractive actually in branch structure. Okay, next slide. Another one, I took this picture down in Southern California in coastal sage scrub, but I like these pictures to show this is not a drought year, but this is a normal summer reaction. When there's not a lot of water, then the plants go kind of like gray and brown and lose a lot of their leaves. And then when the water comes, they start to sprout back and all kinds of action happens. And that's a typical response that is summer dormancy out in nature. Okay, next slide. And here is a patch of hummingbird sage at my dad's. So you can see the one side, we don't water this very much, probably once a month in the summer. So it dies back in the summer, looks raggedy and pretty bad, but it's not in a place where we pay much attention to it, so we don't really worry about it. And then it comes back on its own every winter, and then on the other side, it's blooming in a late winter, early spring. And this plant, this patch is about 10 years old. It slowly spreads. It does the same thing every year. And this is kind of how you know it's summer dormant, because it comes back on its own. If you water it a little bit more, because it's a sage in the mint family, if you water it a little bit more in the summer, you can keep it out or partially out of summer dormancy if you really can't stand all that ugliness. And I wouldn't blame you if it's like front and center in your front yard. I'd probably water it a little bit more all summer and keep it a little greener. Okay, next slide. Then we have the famous Cleveland sage, which is easy to grow in most gardens. And this is the same sage, the brown mess on the top. This is in my yard. Again, this plant is about 12 years old. It's actually now a hedge because I've planted a whole bunch more Cleveland sages next to it. But you can see at the top, part of the brown is because of the smoky air, because this was taken a few days ago. But every year you can see that the leaves get a little shriveled. They're not quite so colorful. And then every winter and spring, they plump right up and then it blooms. So that's perfectly normal. And this is a plant that responds really well if you hedge it back once a year and just take all the dead and dried flowers off of it. Okay, next slide. Okay, we'll go through this one pretty quickly. This is Bladder Pod, also showing a little bit of just natural, normal summer dormancy, a little bit of yellowing showing drought stress, but in general, the leaves are not as colorful and not as plump as they are in the spring. That's just normal, healthy. Okay, next slide. Okay, and this is white sage, same thing. You can see the older leaves especially are just kind of pooped out looking, tired, lacking color. Still has a little bit of color in the newer growth. And then over on the other side, that's spring. And you can see it just looks very vibrant and is blooming. So both of this is the same plant. And every year it will display some of this. And this is another plant that if you try to water it too much, even though it's a sage, if you try to water it too much in the summer to keep it green, you might overwater it and kill it. So try to tolerate a little dormancy in these plants. Okay, next. Okay, a couple of plants that do not do summer dormancy is the California buckwheat and deergrass. So if you see these plants looking brown in the summer, that means you probably need to water them a little bit more and keep them green. And I just threw them in here to remind us all that there are quite a few native plants that don't do summer dormancy. And so if you want to have a garden without plants that do any kind of summer dormancy, it is possible. You just have to ask the questions. Or if you want to say, I can have summer dormancy in the back of the garden, but not in the front, that is perfectly possible. And so you can have a more lush, or I don't know if I'd call these lush, but if you can have a little bit more green towards the front, and more flowers, that's perfectly possible with native plants. Okay, next. Okay, so I told you a whole bunch of things, and I always feel like with this program that it's like, I said a lot of things that are kind of downers and bubble busters. So I wanted to end where a lot of people start and say, why native plants? Well, for one thing, you can have an absolutely beautiful native plant garden. And you can keep them very tidy and neat and not overgrown. They can be in all different styles, very flexible. They can be part of a water conservation practice. And you can use native plants to tell everyone that you know you're in California, and your plants know it too, and you're all quite happy to be here. And so this is called gardening in place or gardening for place. And of course, a lot of people also want the native plant gardens to just increase the habitat value. And that is absolutely true, that if you plant more native plants, you will get more native insects, and you will support the birds and the small mammals and reptiles and amphibians. And that is not nothing. That is a good thing. Okay, next slide. Okay, so the couple of slides that that are missing, I'm gonna, we can stop sharing, and then I'll put up a slide that I was able to load on my iPad. But in the chat, I know Nikki has put up this link. If you want to grab this link, I have this list of 10 native plants that are probably the easiest to start with. If you want to do a native plant garden, maybe start with these. Or if you just want to dabble in native plants and mix them in with some non-native plants, these would probably be the ones to start with. But if we could go back, Carol, could we go back one slide? I wanted to point out something. Also in the top part, that spiky green thing, vine thing, I just snuck that picture in there to also show that I have the 10 list of start here, but I also want to do a nod and a wink to, but there's tons of very odd and interesting native plants, many of which will do very well in your yard. So if you feel like you want to experiment, these plants are all for it. And this plant in there, in that little picture, is called Mara, or wild cucumber. It's a vine that goes gangbusters in winter and spring, and then completely dies to the ground every summer. And no signs of it at all, except maybe the old dried seed pods. And then it comes back every year. So it's a very odd plant, very highly adapted to California, and quite lovely in the spring with the white flowers and then those green seed pods. Okay, thanks, Carol. If we can go on ahead. And in fact, I think what I'll do is, if we can stop sharing your screen, and I'll see if I can share mine real quick. And then it doesn't work, it doesn't work. So let's see if I do this. Got this and this. Okay. Can anybody see that, or did I not do this right? Share. Nobody can see it. Share my screen.
We can see you sitting on a beach.
Oh,
and now we can't.
Sorry. Okay. How about that?
There you are. Yep.
Okay. So one thing we wanted to just mention is that Master Gardeners and myself in my Quercus booth are going to be at this event November 6th at River Ridge. It's a beautiful location. We'll be there in person. There will be
Peyton, I'm sorry, we're looking at your picture on the beach.
Oh, you're not seeing the Foothills Festival poster. Sorry about that. Oh, fiddle. Okay. So I will get back myself so you can see me. Sorry about that. I'm not going to mess around. So just write that down. November 6th, 12 noon to 5 p.m. at River Ridge Ranch in Springville. And there will be many of the organizations that I listed in the resources in my list will be there to answer questions. There will be plants available for you to take home. And there will be music and food and beverages and a nature treasure hunt. It's a lovely family event. So if you want to talk more in person, get some plants, get more advice, bring your photos to show. There'll be CNPS people, Sequoia Riverlands Trust people have been invited. Wildlife people will be there. So thank you, Nikki. Fantastic. It's a valuable book. Okay, so I just wanted to mention that because this is really quick and short, but you do have opportunities to come in person and talk to us. And I will be at Taste of the Arts in Visalia, October 16th with my book, if you want to pick up a copy and have it signed, or just chit chat, it's fine. I'll be at the Tulare Kings Writers Group booth. Okay, so now I think we can open it up for questions. If anybody has some questions.
I have one, and this is probably something I could find on my own, but since I have an expert in front of me, I have a bay tree, and I'm hoping it went into what you're describing as summer dormancy, because if it didn't, then I killed it. Do you know if because I know the bay laurel trees are Mediterranean plants, so they're supposed to do well in areas like this, but are they considered native to the area?
Is this a California bay or a Greek bay?
I know very little about it. I bought it at the gardens when they had a nursery in Tulare, and their tag had very little information. But I know you can use it in cooking.
Okay, so there's two trees that have a common name of bay. One of them is Laurus nobilis, which is from Greece. And the other one is the Umbularia californica, which is native to our foothills, to the Sierra Nevada foothills, and also grows really well in the coastal areas on the other side of the Coast Range. So it's kind of in the coast ranges, but on the west side of the Coast Ranges, and then also in our Sierra Nevada. So if it's the native bay tree, they don't do that well in the valley floor. They're pretty similar to the coastal redwoods in that they need an abundance of water and some cooling off when they're young. If it's a Greek bay, they can do better on the valley floor, but they do require more water than probably you're thinking. They're kind of moderate water. So that's a good thing to keep in mind. That Mediterranean region is that, if you remember that first slide I had on the California floristic province, which is our California Mediterranean zone, that is pretty coastal. And so Mediterranean regions are generally from the coast inland some distance depending on the area. And Chile has a region very much like California, where not all of Chile is a Mediterranean region. And of course, Australia that way too. Greece is almost entirely Mediterranean because almost all of Greece is close to the ocean, relatively speaking. So not all Mediterranean plants do super well here. And that's why also we struggle with a lot of the lavenders here in the valley. So, yeah. Okay. Thanks for asking.
We have Alice. She raised her hand. Alice, can you unmute yourself?
Yes, can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes.
Can you hear me now? Okay. Hi, Peyton.
Hi, Alice.
I wanted to ask, are there any plants that go like less than others? And I'm asking this because I've done so well all year babying these new plants, sages and deer grass and lots of different things through the summer heat. And then just like a few days ago, a Bee's Bliss sage, which was a cutting that I took, and it had been doing fabulous. And it looks like some little beaver gnawed it down. And I thought it was too big for gophers to eat, but that's the only thing I can think it might have been. So can you give your experience with different types of plants and gophers?
Gophers. Yeah. Okay. So we used to say in normal years, pre-drought, pre-wildfire, in normal years, most of the sage and anything in the Artemisia family were not highly bothered by gophers. However,
yeah, that's what I thought.
Yes. However, we've had a sustained drought. And what we've noticed anecdotally over and over, and the researchers are noticing this also with the ground squirrels, is that they're eating practically everything. So I think it's just they're very stressed and they're eating plants that they don't want to. So if you remember back in childhood, and your mother saying, eat it, and you're saying, I don't want to eat it, and your mother says, that's all you've got and you're going to starve if you don't eat it, then eventually you suck it up and you eat it because your stomach is grumbling. That's kind of what's going on. And I'm not trying to talk baby talk because I know you're quite sophisticated about this, but I think it's the gophers are just the same with the deer. Up here in the foothills, we have deer a lot, and they are eating things that they never ate before. So I think it's just a stressed ecosystem right now. And the only thing we can do is just learn from that and say, okay, I'll replant my sage, but I guess I'll have to go for cage even the sage right now and try to keep the rodents off of it. There's also quite an outbreak of, at least in the foothills, we're having the peak vole year, which I don't know if you know, voles, their population goes like this naturally. So when they're up, there's very few things you can do to control them. Then the predators come in and drop, and starvation takes its toll and drops the population. And this year we have a lot of voles also. We're having a high vole year. So that's, the plants are cut off at the crown, not from below, but they're eaten off right at the crown. And then it just topples over and it's dead. That's a vole activity. They eat, and you almost never see voles. They're small. They have abundant holes and they're very small. They're like mice.
Well, maybe that's what this is, maybe because I did not see any gopher activity and it was eaten off above the soil, but it was the stem that was eaten, a big woody stem. I mean, probably a half-inch wood sage stem was eaten.
Yeah. That's probably a vole because that's what they are usually, if you have one, you have 100 or so or more. So they come out and they'll all eat, and then they're gone. So it's very hard to control them because they are able to burrow. So you can do some protection like above ground a little bit, but they're so small, you have to have some wire that's more like the aviary wire, not gopher caging, because they can go through, they're like mice. They can squeeze through almost anything. So most of the experts say to keep open area around your plants because they don't like to be in open areas. And then just do that basket of mesh almost just from ground level up a couple of inches because they don't climb. They're very shy creatures. If you're having abundant attacks, and they will attack native and non-native plants equally. They will do they eat on through sage. And I had one in my dad's garden that they took out a full-grown lantana. Yeah, which also, you'd think is a toxic plant. They probably won't want to eat it, but they did. So, yeah. Anyways, yeah. Nothing you did wrong. Start again.
Right.
Right.
Wow.
Okay.
All right.
Well, anybody who participated, who came on today, appreciate it. Is there something you wanted to hear that I didn't cover? Is there some answer you needed or some information that I didn't cover that you were really hoping to get? Because I'm here to answer anything. So.
Aiden, I want to check with you. Monkey flowers, do they go dormant during summer? Okay.
In nature, they go fully dormant. In nature, in nature here in our area, not so much on the coast, but here in our area, they are fully summer dormant, okay. Brown as sticks. Mm-hmm. And then they come back when the cool weather occurs, which is, so I don't know if any of you that have native plants have noticed this, that the plants that are established are recovering from summer. So as soon as the day times get shorter, and we've had a couple of cool downs, even though we haven't had any rain, but we've had a couple of cooler, and where there's wildfire smoke, the temperatures have been cooler, and the plants are starting to say it's fall, and they're starting to come out of summer dormancy. So the monkey flowers, you should start seeing them come out. The tricky thing is that in garden situations, they may need a little summer water even when they're dormant. And the trick is to just give them that little tiny bit without overwatering them when they're not ready to take it up. And then, you know, you may kill them. So monkey flowers are kind of an advanced native plant because they are a little tricky. But if you find the right spot, then I know if you find the right spot, they're very easy. So that's just, you know, you just have to play around. If you love them and who doesn't, then it's kind of like try them in different locations and different situations and hit upon the right technique for them. But don't worry if they look pretty brown right now, fully or pretty brown. I like to see them in the gardens. What I usually like to do is have people water them just enough to keep a little green somewhere on the plant. Then I know it's alive.
Here's what I am trying. Like
Yeah.
my old one is doing with some green leaves, but I just planted red and orange ones. They kind of, I'm not sure.
Yeah, the red and orange are not from here. The yellow sticky monkey flower is our native one here. And so they are more adaptable to our hot, dry summers. The red and orange are coastal. So they have not adapted as well to being without summer fog. So sometimes with the red and orange flowered ones, you want to just like mist them off more and hose them down a few times to pretend that you're summer fog.
Okay.
You know, rather than give them a lot abundant groundwater, but just try to, especially in the evenings, because the stomata that absorb underneath the leaves, you know, and then the stems that absorb that water will be opening. You know, I mean, nobody's going to be going out there like, you know, at 2 a.m. probably, and okay, you're fully open, let's hose you off. But so if you can do it in the evening and you know, have a little moisture around the plant, that could be helpful.
Okay.
Yeah, and you know, more and more the native plant experts are really advising more to do more hosing off of plants than we had in the past. So don't be afraid to, like, this would be a perfect time of year to hose your plants off in the morning or the evening. Everything is dirty. The plants are dirty. It also prevents or reduces the danger of having spider mites on your plants, and that's native and non-native. A lot of like plants like rosemary get a lot of spider mites, so you can just hose them off like once a month is probably enough or more. You know, within your watering guidelines, I'm not talking about like you're saturating the ground. This is hosing off the leaves and the undersides of the leaves, you know, just it feels good. Humans like it too, and you should feel justified in doing that with your native plant garden, not feel like it's wasteful. Okay.
Thank you.
So we do have a question in the chat, but Aaliyah asked that I talk about the survey real quick before we lose any listeners. We are going to be dropping a survey link in the chat, correct, Aaliyah?
Yes, I already did.
Yes. There it is. Okay. So we have a survey in the chat and we're asking if you could help us out to fill out this survey. Correct me if I'm wrong, but in about 3 months, you'll be receiving an email from UC-A&R, and that email will contain a survey in itself. That survey from UC-A&R will take about 10 minutes, probably less. And it's one of the tools that we use to find out the demographics that we're reaching. So the purpose of this statewide evaluation is to better understand and show the impact of the UC Master Gardener program. We all have stories that we can tell about people that we encounter, but we often lack the data to back those stories up. And in addition to having the information about how many Californians we're reaching, it will allow us to make conclusions about how our program's efforts have impacted California gardening practices, and how it's impacted gardeners' lives, since their attendance at public education workshops and events like this one. Findings from this evaluation are going to be shared with others, including current and future stakeholders, which will help us secure funding for our county's program. We'll also be able to use this data to discuss the program's strengths and areas where we have opportunities to improve. Together, we'll be able to use this information to make a difference and to continue giving great things like this fantastic program to impact our residents and their gardening habits. So if you guys could fill out that survey that's in there, just click that link. It'll open up a new browser window for you. And we really appreciate it. It means a lot to us to have that information. Okay, and the question that is in the chat is from Jesse Snyder. Can our native dogwoods thrive on the valley floor? What other understory trees are good in shape?
Oh, that's a great question. So what I have found is our native dogwoods can survive on the valley floor if they are in shade underneath trees pretty much their whole life, and they are babied along. So really that's a combination of soil pH and temperature. So up in the mountains where they are really, where they grow great, the pH is closer to neutral or slightly acidic in some areas, and that's because of the conifers and the thousands and thousands of years of conifer debris that has acidified the soil somewhat. So you can, I said no fertilizers, but for native dogwoods, you can do a treatment now and again with a food for azaleas, gardenias, blueberries, all those things, and mulch with conifer needles. So this is a high maintenance plant. This is not a low maintenance plant when you put it on the valley floor. So just know that, but yes, they can go. It's just always going to be a high maintenance plant. It's going to be your fancy plant that you're going to devote time to, and it must be in the shade. Understory plants, if you want understory small trees, well, you know, the redbud can definitely be an understory tree. Elderberries are understory tree shrubs that you can prune into a tree. Mule fats are another one that you can prune into a tree. Those do go better in the sun than the shade, but they will grow in the shade. You can do spice bush, which is a large shrub and loves to be understory. And there's nothing that says that you can't prune up a spice bush to be more of a tree shape instead of a shrub. So if you want to go for those, there's also California coffeeberry, which can go understory in the shade. It's just not as available in nurseries, so I don't mention it very often. But that one also can be understory. Did I miss anything? There's lots of understory shrubs, but I think those are the large shrubs and small trees that would work well in understory situations. If something else. Okay. Yeah, did I answer all that? I think I got all that. Yeah. Okay. So an understory, we could say, you know, like, it's great to do an understory garden. I even like that's what I love that question, because if you have a tree, whether it's native or not, you have an understory garden and you can tuck a whole lot of plants that you otherwise couldn't in that zone, especially on the east side or northeast side, where they'll get that, if it's a deciduous tree, it's going to get that summer sun protection. It's going to have the frost protection in the winter from the canopy of the large tree. And you can do all sorts of beautiful native plants there that you couldn't do in an open setting. So, you know, it's a great, create a little woodland understory garden. Great habitat value too. Anything else?
It looks like it's time, Carol.
Well, thank you all for joining.
Oh, thank you. Thank you so much. That was delightful. I really appreciate the opportunity for the library to be involved in this type of programming. And Alaya, I know you'll let me know if you want to continue and do further programming. So thank you so much, everyone, for attending.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.